In this episode, we're going to strengthen something that quietly determines whether you pass the exam and whether you can actually use the ideas later. Rapid recall of governance decisions and risk language. New learners often feel like they understand concepts while listening, but then when they try to explain them out loud, the words feel slippery and the ideas come out in a tangled order. That gap is not a sign that you are not smart, and it does not mean you need harder material. It usually means your brain has not practiced retrieval, which is the act of pulling knowledge back up without being shown at first. Spaced retrieval is a simple method for building that skill because it forces you to recall key ideas repeatedly across time in slightly different contexts until the language becomes natural. Today's goal is not to introduce brand new content, but to sharpen the concepts you already learned so you can produce them quickly, clearly, and consistently. When you can do that, exam questions become easier because you recognize patterns faster and you stop second-guessing basic definitions. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to think about spaced retrieval is that it turns learning from recognition into recall, and those are not the same thing. Recognition is when you hear a term and it feels familiar, like you know it, even if you could not explain it to someone else without help. Recall is when you can generate the definition, the reason it matters, and a simple example on your own, using plain language. Exams usually reward recall disguised as recognition because they present plausible answer choices that all feel familiar, and the correct answer is the one that matches the precise concept. Spaced retrieval works because it repeatedly asks your brain to reconstruct the idea, which strengthens memory and reduces confusion under stress. It also reveals exactly where your understanding is fuzzy, so you can repair it rather than re-listening passively and hoping it sticks. As you practice, you should notice that your answers become shorter but clearer, not because you are compressing, but because the structure becomes automatic. That automatic structure is what lets you stay calm when a question uses unfamiliar wording. You are no longer guessing at meaning. You are matching the scenario to a concept you can actually articulate. Start your rapid recall practice by anchoring the most foundational term in this entire course, because everything else builds on it. Ask yourself to say, out loud, a one-sentence definition of AI risk that includes the idea of harm and the idea of reliance. Then immediately expand it into a two-sentence explanation of why it matters at work. If you struggle, the problem is usually that you describe AI as a tool rather than as a decision influencer, so your definition becomes too technical and not risk-focused. A strong definition connects AI outputs to real outcomes like money loss, safety issues, trust erosion, and legal exposure, because those are the harms leaders care about. After you can say the definition, practice adding a simple example from a normal workplace, like an AI tool that prioritizes customer complaints or drafts customer responses, and explain what could go wrong. This is not about telling a long story. It is about showing that you can connect the term to a real process. The reason this matters for governance is that governance depends on shared language, and shared language begins with shared definitions. If you cannot define the key terms cleanly, committees and policies become debates about words instead of decisions about risk. Now shift your recall to governance ownership, because governance decisions collapse quickly when ownership is unclear. Ask yourself to explain the difference between a role, accountability, and decision rights without using jargon, then apply it to a simple AI use case. If you find yourself blending responsibility and accountability, pause and correct it, because that confusion leads directly to weak answers on exam questions about governance. Accountability is being answerable for outcomes, not merely doing tasks, and decision rights are the authority to approve, require changes, or stop deployment. Practice saying that the business owner of the process is accountable for the outcomes influenced by AI, even if technical teams build or operate the system. Then practice saying what technical owners are accountable for, which is typically technical performance, controls, monitoring execution, and being honest about limitations. This matters because in many scenarios, the best governance answer is the one that assigns accountability to the people who own the business outcomes and gives technical teams authority to block deployment when minimum controls are missing. When you can recall this quickly, you stop choosing tempting but flawed answers that push accountability onto vendors or onto generic committees. Ownership language is a control in itself because it prevents the organization from hiding responsibility behind automation. From there, recall the purpose of an AI governance committee in a way that is specific and practical, not vague. Say out loud that the committee exists to make high-impact decisions consistent, to apply standards, and to ensure decision rights and oversight are clear, then explain what the committee should not do. Beginners often describe a committee as a place to discuss AI, but executives do not pay for discussion. They pay for controlled decisions. A committee should not review every low-impact use case, because that creates bottlenecks and encourages shadow behavior, and that is an important exam-ready nuance. Now practice connecting the committee to a charter, because the charter is the mechanism that makes governance predictable rather than political. Explain that a charter defines purpose, scope, authority lines, required evidence, cadence, and how decisions are recorded, and emphasize that authority lines matter because optional governance is not governance. The reason this recall matters is that governance questions often give you choices that sound reasonable but lack enforceability. If you can immediately recognize missing authority or missing documentation expectations, you will choose the more defensible governance design. Next, strengthen your recall of risk appetite and risk tolerance by practicing how you would explain them to a leader in under a minute. The fastest check is whether you can state appetite as a broad stance and tolerance as specific limits and triggers, then tie both to the use context. If you only talk about appetite as comfort level, you are missing the decision function, because appetite should shape what types of harm the organization will accept and what types it will avoid. If you only talk about tolerance as an error rate, you are missing the broader boundary idea, because tolerance can also be expressed as conditions like requiring human review for high-impact decisions. Practice using harms as anchors, like money, safety, trust, and law, because those anchors make appetite defensible and memorable. Then practice saying how tolerance connects to escalation, because a tolerance boundary that does not trigger action is not a boundary. This is where spaced retrieval helps, because you want these relationships to be automatic when an exam question asks what leadership should set to guide AI adoption. When you can recall that appetite and tolerance translate into boundaries and triggers, you stop choosing answers that rely on vague promises of responsible use. You choose answers that create enforceable decision discipline. Now bring your recall to policy language, because policy is where governance turns into daily behavior. Ask yourself to explain why a practical AI policy must distinguish allowed, restricted, and prohibited use, then give one example of each in plain terms. If you struggle, it is often because you drift into tool names or technical configuration, which is not the point at the policy level. The point is to set behavioral boundaries tied to impact and data sensitivity, so employees know what they can do without approval and what requires governance review. Practice saying that restricted use often includes high-impact decisions and sensitive data handling, which requires documented approval, oversight, and monitoring. Practice saying that prohibited use blocks unacceptable harms, like using unapproved tools with sensitive data or using AI as a final authority in high-stakes contexts without appropriate review. Then recall that standards sit under policy, because standards define repeatable evidence requirements and oversight expectations, turning responsible AI themes into enforceable practice. This matters for the exam because policy and standards are often confused, and many incorrect choices mix them by proposing technical instructions as policy. When your recall is sharp, you can see the level mismatch instantly and select the answer that matches governance design. Next, focus retrieval on documentation expectations, because documentation is where defensibility is stored. Ask yourself to name what evidence must exist for a high-impact AI use case, but do it as a coherent story rather than as a checklist. Start by stating intended use and boundaries, because misuse is common when purpose is vague. Then state impact classification and who is affected, because oversight should scale with harm potential. Then state data sources and data flows, because privacy and fairness risk cannot be assessed without knowing what data is used. Then state evaluation evidence and limitations, because justified trust requires proof, not belief. Finally, state approvals, ownership, monitoring plans, and change history, because ongoing control depends on traceability over time. When you practice this as a story, your recall becomes easier because each piece naturally leads to the next, and you sound confident without memorizing a rigid sequence. This story approach also matches how executives and auditors think, because they want to know what you did, why you did it, and how you know it is controlled. Documentation is not only for compliance. It is for faster response when problems appear. If you can recall the documentation narrative quickly, you can answer many different scenario questions that involve missing evidence or unclear accountability. Inventory and impact classification deserve their own retrieval practice because they are foundational controls that many organizations neglect. Say out loud why an inventory is not merely a list of tools, but a map of where automated judgment influences outcomes, including vendor features and shadow use. If you forget shadow AI, you miss one of the most common real-world risk sources because unapproved usage often bypasses governance and data rules. Practice explaining that inventory must include models, data, vendors, and workflow context, because risk depends on how outputs are used, not only on what the tool is. Then practice the impact classification logic by asking yourself what changes impact, and answer using consequences, scale, reversibility, and decision context. A high-impact system is one where being wrong can cause severe harm or where obligations require transparency and defensibility, especially in critical decisions and safety roles. This matters because classification is what allows proportional governance, meaning tighter controls where harm is severe and lighter controls where harm is low. When you can retrieve this quickly, you stop treating every AI use case the same and you start applying correct oversight levels. That skill shows up repeatedly in exam questions where multiple answers propose controls, but only one matches the impact. Now strengthen your recall of integrating AI risk into enterprise risk management, because executives expect AI risk to fit into the enterprise risk picture. First, say the term in full once and notice how it feels, because many learners stumble simply from unfamiliar acronyms. Then practice explaining integration as shared language, shared processes, and shared metrics, and connect each to a practical benefit. Shared language means AI risks can be compared to other risks using likelihood, impact, and control terms leadership already uses. Shared processes means AI use cases move through existing intake, assessment, treatment, monitoring, and escalation channels instead of creating a parallel governance world. Shared metrics means leadership can see trends and control health, not just project status, and can allocate resources based on risk posture. This matters because fragmented risk governance is one of the easiest ways to create gaps where AI projects move quickly without oversight. If you can recall integration cleanly, you will recognize that many strong answers emphasize consistency, comparability, and defensibility rather than creating new isolated AI processes. The exam often rewards that integration mindset because it matches how real organizations scale risk management. Next, practice your recall of control thinking in a way similar to control objectives for information and related technologies, COBIT, because this is where governance becomes repeatable. Begin by stating that a control objective is what you want to be true, a practice is how you make it true, and assurance is how you prove it is true. Then apply it to AI by creating a simple objective, like ensuring only approved high-impact AI use cases influence decisions. And then describe practices like intake review, documentation evidence, monitoring, and decision rights. Finally, describe assurance as reviewing evidence, checking that monitoring occurs, and verifying that exceptions are controlled rather than informal. This practice matters because many learners can talk about controls in general, but cannot connect them to AI without getting lost in technical detail. When you recall this objective practice assurance pattern, you gain a tool for answering a wide range of questions about governance design, because you can translate almost any scenario into what objective is threatened, what practice is missing, and what evidence would show improvement. It also helps you avoid answers that propose a single fix, like buying a tool, without establishing a control system. Framework-style thinking is not about memorizing a framework. It is about using a repeatable method for managing risk. Now connect this to key risk indicators, KRIS, by practicing how you would explain them to someone who has never heard the term. Start with the idea that KRIS are early warning signals that move before harm becomes severe, then connect them to thresholds and action. For AI, practice naming one signal that could indicate drift, one that could indicate fairness concerns, and one that could indicate misuse, but do it in conversational language rather than technical metric labels. Then practice stating that KRIS are only useful when they trigger escalation, because a warning light that nobody responds to is not a control. This recall matters because many learners confuse performance metrics with risk indicators, and on exam questions that confusion can lead to choices that measure accuracy without warning about rising harm. When you remember that KRIS are about early detection of increasing risk and weakening controls, you will gravitate toward answers that include monitoring trends, thresholds, and response ownership. You will also be able to link KRIS back to risk tolerance, because tolerance boundaries define when a signal becomes a leadership concern. This is the kind of cross-connection that spaced retrieval builds, and it is exactly what makes your thinking feel more automatic. Another important retrieval target is executive translation, because the exam often expects you to communicate risk without technical fog. Practice stating that executives need outcomes, options, and ownership, supported by concise evidence, not deep technical explanation. Then practice translating a technical concern into business harm language, such as explaining drift as increasing unreliability that can drive wrong decisions and undermine trust or compliance. Practice offering two plausible action options in prose, such as tightening human review for high-impact cases while investigating or temporarily restricting automation until monitoring confirms stability. The key is to keep the message decision-focused, because leaders need to choose boundaries and allocate resources. This retrieval practice helps you recognize the difference between a technically correct answer and an executive-ready answer in exam questions. It also reduces your own anxiety, because you no longer feel you must be a technical expert to speak credibly about risk. Credibility comes from clarity, evidence, and defensible reasoning, not from jargon. When your recall includes this translation habit, you can move from concept to communication smoothly. As you continue spaced retrieval, pay attention to the misconceptions that commonly interfere with correct answers, because those misconceptions often return under stress. One misconception is that vendors own the risk, when the organization using AI remains accountable for outcomes and must document boundaries and oversight. Another misconception is that governance means a committee does everything, when effective governance scales with impact and uses clear decision rights and charters. Another misconception is that documentation is optional because it feels slow, when documentation is the evidence that makes decisions defensible and response faster. Another misconception is that fairness is a one-time test, when fairness can drift as populations and data shift and must be monitored. Another misconception is that monitoring is the same as assurance, when monitoring is a control practice and assurance is the verification that practices are actually operating. Spaced retrieval works well here because you can practice correcting misconceptions in your own words, which makes the correction durable. When a question offers an answer that quietly contains a misconception, you will feel the mismatch immediately because your recall has been trained around the correct relationship between concepts. This is how rapid recall becomes a practical exam advantage rather than just a memory trick. To close, spaced retrieval review is the process of turning domain 1 governance language into a set of concepts you can produce quickly, accurately, and calmly under pressure. You practiced recalling AI risk as outcome-focused harm tied to reliance, ownership as the separation of roles, accountability, and decision rights, and governance as enforceable structures supported by charters and authority lines. You reinforced appetite and tolerance as defensible boundaries and triggers, policy and standards as practical behavioral rules backed by evidence, and documentation as the story that proves responsible decisions over time. You strengthened inventory and impact classification as the visibility and proportionality tools that make governance usable, and you connected AI risk into ERM as shared language, shared processes, and shared metrics. You also recalled control thinking in a COBIT-like pattern of objectives, practices, and assurance, and you link KRIS to early warning and escalation. Most importantly, you practice translation for executives so risk becomes actionable without technical fog. If you keep revisiting these ideas with small retrieval sessions across days, the language will become automatic, and that automaticity will make both the exam and real-world decisions feel far more manageable.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.